Okay, perfect. So we have moved on to chapter 5, and we're talking about professional codes of ethics. So we talked about personal codes of ethics a few weeks ago, if you remember, and you have an assignment to create a personal code of ethics, okay? But today we're talking about professional codes of ethics. So what is a professional code of ethics? Well, these are professional codified documents that bring together the expectations of members of an association or more generally like a profession. Okay. So any given profession usually has some kind of professional association with it, right? That has like elected members of the profession that come together and they make they do a few things. So one of the biggest things they do is accreditation, right? So they'll go through and they'll make sure a good example is for public administration. ASPA is the biggest accreditation body for public administration. So any MPA program seeks the accreditation of ASPA. So ASPA members, the board, will come to the O'Neill School and they'll observe what the classes are like, what they're teaching, what the faculty looks like, all of these different opportunities, right? And they'll stick they'll stamp their approval and give their accreditation to the program, right? And this is to try and separate between the programs that are up to snuff and those that are not, okay? And so this is usually, the code of ethics are usually developed by these professional associations in an effort to codify or make clear what the ethical expectations are for that profession, okay? And so what it does, it gives the professional association a way or a standard by which they can judge its members. So if I want to know what makes a good lawyer, I can look up the code of ethics, right? See what's expected, and they can judge lawyers based off of these codes, okay? It's important to remember that we're not talking about ethical laws here. So sure, there are definitely ethical laws, especially for public administrators, people that work in government, okay? There are specific laws that dictate what you can and can't do in the profession. This isn't so much legal as it is professional, okay? So it doesn't have legal weight when they make these documents, okay? It's essentially just a way for the group, the profession, to be able to determine who's in and who's out and who's following the standards the values that they espouse, okay? So what exactly is in a professional code of ethics? There are four different ways or four different kinds of statements that show up in these codes of ethics, and the text highlighted these. So we have don't statements, we have obligations and responsibilities, virtues, personal qualities and or values, and then finally we have aspirations as well. Okay, so let's go through each of these for just a little bit. What's a don't statement? Well, this is the second most popular or common form of statement amongst professional codes of ethics, okay? And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a statement that says, don't do this, okay? So if we think back to the principles approach that we studied in our philosophy section, think of this as similar to the principles approach. We're going to identify principles. Don't do this, don't do this, okay? They cover prohibited actions and behavior, and they tend to be really specific. Don't do X, right? But they don't do much to elevate our ethical thinking. So in other words, we're stuck at this point at stage 4. Do you remember stage 4 of moral reasoning, where it's mainly out of just kind of duty and obligation to society? Okay, so this is just to this is the professional association's way of saying, hey, we're making clear what the expectation is, and you have a duty and obligation to respond to it, okay? Typically they're rule based. So a great popular examples, the 10 commandments, right? Like thou shalt not. This is what it means to have a rule based, don't based kind of rule, okay? And then finally, they're intended to reduce misbehavior, but they don't really do anything to promote positive ethical behavior. So really, we're just talking about damage control with these statements, okay? More often than not, if there's a don't statement in a code of ethics, it probably means they've gotten burned from some kind of behavior in the past. There's probably someone who did something stupid, and so they went ahead and made a don't do X, very specific, right? Because there's probably been an example in the past where they've gotten burned on that kind of a thing, okay? So an example is make no private promises of any kind. Okay, that's an actual one from a professional code of ethics in government. Okay, make no private promises of any kind. It's an example of a don't statement. Okay, obligations and responsibilities. If you'll remember back, what does this sound like? Which approach to ethics? The duty approach, right? We've been talking about the duty approach time and time again. And surprise, surprise, guess which one was the most common statement overall in code of ethics? Duties, right? So duty definitely it continues to tend to be the top approach for how to handle ethical behavior in public organizations, especially. Okay, but these duty and obligation statements are the opposite. So instead of saying what you shouldn't do, these say what should be done. Okay, and so because of that, they tend to be a little bit more general than the don't statements. They're not quite as specific. And they're also subject to interpretation. So they're a little bit more abstract, maybe not quite so clear. So good example, uphold the Constitution and the law, right? So you can see how that's just one step up in generalization. And it's a little bit more abstract, right? It's not quite so clear cut as to what it means to uphold the Constitution and the law as it is to like, don't make private promises, right? That's very specific and easy to follow. Okay. Next, we have virtues, personal qualities, and or values. Which is this like? This is like the virtue-based approach to ethics, right? So rather than focusing on actions of what should or shouldn't be done, this focuses on statements of how one should be, right? Rather than what one should do. And so obviously these are even more general than the obligations or on don't statements, okay? And they require translating being something into doing, okay? So for example, we could codify, we could include this tenet in our code of ethics, demonstrate personal integrity, okay? That's a little bit hard to translate into doing. So it's a B, right? We want people with integrity. And so it requires then moving that to say, okay, well, what does an integritous person do? Do you remember this discussion with virtue ethics, right? That the virtue, the ideal that we're after, should set the tone for what actions lead to that behavior, that being. Okay, so that's what we're after here. We're going to outline and say, here's all the characteristics or personal virtues that we value, and so we want to translate action that will help us become these things. Okay, and then finally, this one's a little bit different than what we've talked about in the past, but professional codes of ethics also include aspirations. Okay, this is essentially the field's way of saying this is who we aspire to be as a field. So it's a little more macro, like, right? They're not just talking about like individual behavior, they're talking about the collective behavior of the entire group, who they aspire to be. So they outline the desirable conditions that they seek to promote as opposed to actions or personal qualities. So what are the desirable conditions of the field that we want to create? Definitely the most general, right? These are going to be super broad, super abstract. They're really not concrete. They're not tied to specific behaviors. These are just general like goals and aspirations for what we want for the field. So it requires asking the question of like, okay, well, what actions should be taken to achieve these conditions? So an example of this: be dedicated to the concepts of effective and democratic local government by responsible elected officials. Okay, so you can see here, this doesn't say anything about specific action. Like I can't read that and determine here's what I'm supposed to do on a day-to-day basis. But you can see here how they're making some kind of aspirational statement about the field of local government, right? They want to be dedicated as a field to the concepts of effectiveness and democracy, right? Okay, so we have these 4 different kinds of statements. All of them play different and important roles in setting kind of the professional code for the field, right?